All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you happen to be. You may notice a couple of things are a little bit different. This is definitely an indication that today is a Bones Day. We're back in the studio, or at least I'm back in the studio, and it feels really good to finally be back here. It also feels really good to be bringing back on my compatriot Cecil Phillip to chat about Blazor. Cecil, welcome back. Thanks for joining.
Thanks you so much for having me here. I know the last time I was on, we had a ton of fun. So I'm definitely looking forward to doing it again and talking about some cool things.
Me too. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with Cecil, Cecil's done an awful lot of .NET. You've probably seen him up and down YouTube and Learn TV and everywhere else, hosting a couple of different .NET shows. He does an awful lot with Blazor, which is what he's going to be talking about. But let me ask you this, Cecil, is how did you get into C#? How did you get into .NET?
Sure. I was actually in college doing my degree, and I don't know why, for some reason, there was this book, I think it was C# in 24 hours or something like that. Remember back in the day when they used to have those Learn X in 24 hours or Learn X in 21 days kind of books? Mm-hmm. But anyway, I found one of those books and I just picked it up and started reading it. And I wasn't doing it for class, I wasn't doing it for a project or anything like that. Like, I was just very naturally curious about learning the language, and I think it was C# 1.0 at the time. So this was .NET is like new and fresh, right? And I liked it. It was very much similar to Java, which I had some experience in doing because that's what they taught us in college. And so for me, it wasn't like I was adding a lot of extra baggage, right? Like, it felt very similar and familiar, which was really cool. And I just started playing around with it. And lo and behold, when I graduated from college, my first job was writing C# and web applications, which at the time was very scary, right? Because I had no idea what I was doing. I've never written anything for production or anything that anyone more than like two people are going to use. Excuse me. So it was definitely. It's definitely a little bit of shock and awe, but it's been a great experience so far. And now years later, I'm still writing C#, and we're having a good time.
That's fantastic, and C# has certainly changed just a little bit since since back then. And I definitely do remember those like 24-hour books, and I always got a kick out of it because some of them were like this thick, like 700 pages. Sure, 24 hours, absolutely, yeah. Right. You could get through that in 24 hours.
I mean, we all read like 1,000-page book in 24 hours, right? Like, that's normal.
Well, yeah, of course. Yeah,
of course.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. So you're back here again to chat about Blazor, and let's go ahead and set the stage for anybody who's maybe not overly familiar with what Blazor is. So let's just start there. And I've got a couple of other follow-up questions about Blazor and other frameworks, but let's start with what is Blazor?
Okay, so for like the quick elevator pitch, Blazor is a web framework that you could use to write applications that run in the browser. So if you're a JavaScript developer, you might be familiar with things like React or Vue.js or Angular or any of those family of tools, right? Like, you write some JavaScript, I ship it with my HTML and CSS into the browser, and then they kind of run within the sandbox that is the browser. Well, with Blazor, instead of writing JavaScript, I can write .NET, right? So that means I could write C#. We have a templating language called Razor, and so you could use those types of tools. And instead of, again, shipping JavaScript to the browser, you could ship .NET to the browser, which is really cool. And I think the main benefit that folks get out of that is, well, if I'm already familiar with this ecosystem of stuff, like I already know .NET, I already know C#, I already know Razor pages, or that Razor templating syntax, then it's a very comfortable transition for me from going to building regular web applications that are rendered on the server side to doing browser-based applications that are using C# and Blazor. Right. So you can kind of think about it that way, right? So for a lot of .NET developers that might have a love-hate relationship with JavaScript a little bit, you don't have to. Now you have Blazor as an option that you could use to write your apps with.
That's fantastic. And the point that you bring up about, that it's perfect for people who are already familiar with C# and .NET, I think is really important that, we've had John Papa on in the past, we've had Damola Omotosho on, and, one of the things that we wound up talking about with both of them was why should somebody choose a particular framework, be it, Blazor, React, Svelte, or whatever else it is that you have. And their answers, for both of them, and I'm going to guess the answer would be the same for you, is use what feels comfortable. Use, what it is that everybody around you knows, what it is that your team knows. So if everybody's already familiar with .NET and maybe, like you said, that they're not necessarily thrilled about having to write JavaScript, which can certainly be a bit of a challenge at times. I think everybody could agree with that, instead of going out and forcing yourself, hey, I'm now going to learn React and I'm now going to learn JavaScript, let me instead use Blazor, use C#, use what I'm already familiar with.
Yeah, exactly. If you kind of look at, I like to call it the culture of software development, right? There's a multitude of different languages and each with their own specific, strengths and weaknesses. But across the board, what you'll notice is, for instance, let's look at JavaScript, right? Before, JavaScript was just in the browser. And now you can write JavaScript in the server. Because why? The folks that write JavaScript, I want to write, things that exist outside of the browser. So now I'm going to look at things like Deno or Node or something like that, because I want to be able to reuse my skills somewhere else. But still, I want to be productive. Because you got to think about it, like how much time is it going to take me to learn something new? And then if you're a business, how much money is it going to cost you to retrain your developers to do something else, right? Or to learn a different language or a different platform? Because you got to factor that into the situation sometimes, because developers are not cheap. And so, you having them spend time to learn a thing, even though learning is always a great investment, you got to think about productivity too. Like, I want my developers to be productive, and if they already know this ecosystem and if they're already familiar with it, then why not have them leverage this because they already know, just to be able to target like different platforms and different targets, right? Because again, at the end of the day, it's about working efficiently and working comfortably, and really, continuing to build upon like those investments you've already made in tooling and your build setup and whatever automation you have, without having to worry about, oh man, I gotta automate this other thing now, or I have these other languages I gotta think about.
Right. So then, right along those lines, how does Blazor then compare to, and let's just put them all into one basket here, kind of the four major JavaScript frameworks of Svelte, Blazor, Vue, and Angular?
Okay, so there's two different ways I like to look at that from. So let's look at it from the programming model perspective. I think if you're a person that, again, if you're familiar with things like React and Vue.js specifically, those use very much of a component model type syntax, right? You create these custom tags, and these custom tags have some type of functionality that are backed by your framework and the JavaScript that you're going to write. With Blazor, it's something somewhat of a similar perspective. From the case of, I can start creating these different components that represent the different sections of my app or my page, and behind each of those different components, now I could start writing .NET code instead of JavaScript code. But again, it's still CSS and HTML, but now I'm writing it in .NET, and those components now will be powered by that .NET runtime. So that's one way to look at it. So from that perspective, it's a little bit similar. So if you could look at React and read it, like you could probably look and read Blazor to a certain extent, right? Like I'll have my markup at the top, and I'll have my code at the bottom, in that type of setup. Now, from the other perspective, JavaScript runs natively in the browser. So when you're building something with maybe using Parcel or Webpack, or I think it's called Vite or Vite or something like that, whatever the new bundling, whatever the new bundling thing is called now. Essentially what that does is it just packages up your JavaScript and sends it to the browser, right? And it's only sending the code over, right? It's only sending JavaScript over, because JavaScript itself, the engine that runs it, right? Whether it's V8 or whatever Edge uses, I think Edge uses V8 now, runs inside of the browser. So I don't have to add any additional components to that. But .NET does not run natively in the browser. Neither does things like Rust or Python or any other language that's not really JavaScript, right? So what needs to happen now is there needs to be somewhat of a little tiny runtime that gets sent along with your application to be able to interpret like those other languages. And so what's been happening over the past couple of years, a lot of companies have been investing in this technology called WebAssembly, or you might see it's spelled out as WASM, right? WASM. And what WebAssembly does is, one, it gives you almost like this little sandboxed environment that you can start executing native code, but inside of your browser. And so what a lot of folks have done is, they've used that sandbox to be able to ship really lightweight runtimes for, again, Rust is one, and .NET is another one as an example today. And I think there are one or two experimental ones for Python. I'm not sure what the status of those are. But the whole point is now I could run other things that are not JavaScript within the browser. So again, going back to what I was saying earlier, if you think about productivity, if you're like, oh, wow, like I could not have to learn another language, but maybe I've been writing machine learning models, or I've been writing, web APIs with .NET, or I've been, using these other languages. Now I could still be productive inside of this browser space just by using some of these native tools within that WebAssembly sandbox.
Okay, I dig that. By the way, I'm going to real quick aside here, just because I don't know if I was on camera or not for a couple of minutes. But if anybody saw me on my phone, it was because I was logged out of Twitch, and I just wanted to be able to respond. And I have two-factor authentication turned on. So if anybody saw me on my phone, that's what I was doing there. But bringing it back to the conversation, there's a couple of great questions here from YouTube, and the first is from Terry, which is: suppose you're a newbie, which direction would you go, Blazor or JavaScript?
If I was a newbie, that's okay. Well, I'd always say it depends, right? It's always that consultant's answer. Like, it depends. So learning Blazor, you're essentially saying that you have to learn .NET, right? Like, learning JavaScript is learning JavaScript, but like learning Blazor, I have to learn .NET, and I also have to learn that Razor syntax. When you talk about learning JavaScript, you're just talking about learning a language, but then on top of that, now I have to learn a framework, right? So I guess I'm saying that Blazor and JavaScript are not synonymous. Like, they're not one-to-one, right? Like, so JavaScript would be, the equivalent to JavaScript would be learning C#, and the equivalent to learning Blazor would be learning another JavaScript framework, like, again, Vue.js or React or something of that nature. So kind of coming back a little bit now, like, so which one will I learn first, right? Like a JavaScript stack or a .NET stack? I would tell you, just, it depends on what you're trying to do. I personally know a little bit of both. I know more .NET and C# than I know JavaScript. But I think what's useful is trying to understand, well, what else am I going to do with this, right? Like, am I going to write web applications? Am I going to want to write mobile applications in the future? Am I doing anything with, I don't know, maybe microservices in the cloud? And what is my team doing? Like, what are my partners or my colleagues or my coworkers working at, right? Like, so how do we interoperate and how do we work together? So I think it really just depends on, what do you think is going to, again, what's going to make you comfortable, what's going to bring you the most joy out of writing, and depending on your job or the task that you're trying to complete, you can kind of weigh the pros and cons. Okay. I would tell you that, hey, it's nothing wrong with learning all of them, but we only have so much time, and if your job is not paying you to sit down and evaluate languages and tools all day, then you probably have to pick one. If it's just for recreational purposes, I would tell you that there's no wrong answer. Like, I'd say just pick one and try it out, and if you don't like it, then just do something else.
Okay, fair enough. I'd kind of like a job where I just get to play around with different frameworks and just see how they all work.
That would be fun, right? They should make one of those.
Yeah. Let's see. Jose Silva asked the question, kind of two, is, do we need state management in Blazor like it's needed in Flutter?
That's funny. So first off, shout out to Jose. So Jose shows up to my shows every single week. Every single live stream I do, Jose is there. So real quick, shout out to Jose. I know Jose's out of Brazil, so just want to say hi to him. Do we need state management like we do in Flutter? So I'll be honest with you, I have never built a Flutter application, and I don't know what that feels like or look like. But I will tell you that, if you're doing anything where you have to, and this is, regardless of whether we're talking about JavaScript or .NET or, Vue.js or Blazor, assuming that you're going to have these different components that, make up your application that you're going to kind of put together like Lego pieces, there's always going to be a need for you to, either signal, between each other or, communicate state between each other or something of the sort. And, you're going to have to figure out, well, what's going to be the best way for you to personally do that. Blazor has some ways that you can do it, by passing down events and properties or, using callbacks and things of that nature. Or, there's a lot of other frameworks like MVVM frameworks. MVVM stands for Model View Model frameworks that have some of that stuff built in that you could kind of leverage if you wanted to. So do you need to, I'm guessing Flutter probably has the same thing. Again, I've never built a Flutter app, so I can't comment on it. But yeah, you're going to need to figure out like what's going to be the way that you want to do that communication, and then looking at the framework, what does it have out of the box, and am I going to need anything additional on top of that?
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So I know that, and Jose is showing you some love back as well.
Nice.
So yeah. So I know that you brought a little demo
Yes.
with Blazor. So what have you got to show us today?
All right, so let me go ahead. I'm going to share my screen right now. So this demo is actually I think it's a really interesting demo. It's a little bit different than the demos that I usually do. So really quickly, so I'm inside of Visual Studio Code right now. When you build Blazor applications, you have a few different options, right? Like you have the option of running it just as a JavaScript thing, like static assets. You can run it hosted inside of an ASP.NET application, which is really cool. It's just one project. You also have the option of generating a template that gives you your front end, your back end, both in different folders. But then now it can actually reuse the code back and forth, right? Which I think is really cool. What I'm doing in this particular demo is I'm just running an application in one place, right? Like so, I just have it, set up where I only have one app. And so this one is actually called. I'm in the wrong folder. Hold on, let me make sure I'm in the right folder. There we go.
While he's getting to the right folder, it's worth highlighting the fact that Cecil is using a Mac here with VS Code.
I am using a Mac with VS Code. VS Code is one of my favorite editors to use for a couple of reasons. One, I could change languages and I could just be in one place and I don't have to change tools, which I think is cool. And also too, I love how all my settings kind of just sync and like move back and forth with me. So, that's a big one for me. All right, so I'm going to open up this demo, and first I'll show you what the demo does, and we'll talk through it a little bit, and feel free to go ahead and ask questions. And then after that, we could talk about like how it was built and what are some of the things that are happening here. Now, this is a really quick sample application I put together. This is a customer purchases dashboard. What it does is it goes out into the backend and it's going to load a bunch of customer data. Now, as you can see, there's this little spinner going, and it's going to go for a long time because, well, sometimes you want to load your application data, or sometimes you want to pull some stuff into your UI, but it takes a long time. So like, what are some interesting ways that we could load like a lot of information and then kind of delay the rendering of the UI? That's one of the things I want to show you. But essentially what this does is, it gives us pretty much some really brief summaries about how many customers we have, how many products we have, who are our top customers, and what are our top products, right? Like what are we selling the most of? And this is it. This is the whole app, right? Like this is the page. There's no other links or anything like that, right? But for us to do this, there's a lot of interesting ways that I guess we could decompose this application. And for the folks that are watching us live right now, I want you to take a second to look at this and tell me, well, where do you think the functionality is, and which ones of these things do you think are components, right? Now, I mentioned components a couple of times when we're talking about that JavaScript versus Blazor, or that Blazor versus other JavaScript frameworks conversation. Now, a lot of the ways that folks build single page applications or browser rendered applications is what they do is recreate what are called these custom components. And so each component, right, does a very specific thing. And then as it's doing its particular job, based on whatever your application is doing, you got to kind of put them together to create the UI. So, as you're looking here, like you might see like there may be multiple components here that are kind of coming together to create this single page app. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to head over to Visual Studio Code, back over, and let's see exactly like how this was put together. So let's switch back over. So the first thing I want to show you about Blazor, right? If in case you've never done Blazor before, if you're doing the hosted version, and the hosted version just means it's being rendered inside of an ASP.NET Core application, this is pretty much what like that default layout page would look like, or that hosting page, right? So as you can see here, this from line 8 all the way down here, like most of this is just standard HTML, and and there's some JavaScript things here at the bottom, right? But to actually put my Blazor application into a web page, this is the thing that I need right here, right? At least for ASP.NET Core, right? I need to say, hey, I want you to look for this component, right? And this is a component that I've written again in .NET, and I want you to put it here, right? Like I want you to insert the component here inside of my app. Now, two other things I want you to notice too, because I get this question asked a lot, is we're also using Bulma, and we're also using Font Awesome. Because that's a question I get asked a lot, like how do I use other styling frameworks like, Material UI or Bulma or Tailwind, or is it Tailwind?
Tailwind.
Tailwind?
Tailwind.
CSS, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Tailwind CSS and all these other CSS frameworks. Well, again, because we're just writing HTML and JavaScript for the most part, then you just include it just like you would like in any standard JavaScript application or any standard web application, right? We don't have to do anything special to pull these things in, and your workflow will be pretty much similar.
Okay.
Okay.
Real quick question: that component tag, is that baked into HTML5? Is that something that's being picked up by the Blazor JavaScript? That's, I'm assuming, like going to be mounting the page.
Sure. So where's this component tag coming from? So remember earlier I said that I'm hosting this inside of an ASP.NET Core application, right? So remember, there's a couple models. I can have my Blazor app and a backend, and they're separate, or I can have them together in the same project. So this is the one where it's together in the same project.
Okay.
So what will happen now? And again, when I say the same project, it's the same ASP.NET Core project. I don't think we could do this with like if the backend was Java or Python or something. But now what you're seeing here, this particular component here, like ASP.NET Core knows about this component, like it knows what it is. And it's saying, okay, I want you to look for, the app, right? And the app is pretty much the entry point into my Blazor application. And I want you to stick it in right here. Pretty much is what's happened. Okay. So the next thing I want you to take a look at, let's head over to the next layout file. I'm going to go through all the layout files because folks always want to know, like, how do we actually compose these things together? Right. And so the layout file here, well, this is pretty much what I use. You don't have to, but you could use this to kind of create the shell of your application. So if you kind of go back here, right, like this application has a particular shell. You might notice there's certain borders, and there's a header and a nav bar and all of these types of things, right? So this is what I kind of call the shell, right? Like again, we're just kind of containing your app inside of a thing. And so this is pretty much the shell, right? Notice I have like a container class here. If you're using, again, I'm using Bulma in this case. If you're using Bootstrap or anything like that, like you might have your own navigation bar, styling and CSS and things of that nature. But again, the important part that I want you to see here is this is just standard CSS and HTML for the most part, right? I haven't done anything different other than now I'm creating like layout pages for these things, right? Another important thing to know, this application only has one page as in like one browser rendered page. But if I had multiple pages, right, this is the point that they get injected, right? So like you'll see in a second, I have an index, like an index component. My indexes automatically go here, right? Like whenever I go to that default route. But you can imagine if I had, a slash customers or a slash products or a slash about us page or anything of the sort, right? Those will all get swapped in right here, right, in the body section. Okay, so far you've just seen like the base. So this is the thing that's hosting the application, and then this is like the main layout, right? So we've seen the hosting application, which is the server-side piece. This part here is going to be in the browser. Let me show you what the index page looks like now. And so we spoke a little bit about, well, I've mentioned a few times that there's these components, right? Everything inside of Blazor in terms of UI is pretty much a component. right? And a component is made up of, again, HTML and CSS and a little bit of C# and the syntax we have called Blazor. Now, in this particular component, like I mentioned too, this is what's going to get injected into that main layout page. As you take a look through this, you'll notice that we have columns, but then when we look at this section here in particular, you might see some tags that don't look standard, right? Like hopefully the folks in the chat and watching us live can notice we have a tag here called load me later, and I'll tell you what that does in a second. But then I also have
I appreciate it. It's very fitting. You've got load me later, and yeah, I'm going to tell you about that later. So we'll load the answer later.
Exactly. I'll tell you about load me later a little bit later. And we also have 2 custom tags, info title here, and then, well, there's actually 3. There's info title, right? And then I also have a customer table and a products table. Now, from the perspective of Blazor, those are all the custom components that I've created that I'm composing my application with, right? If you think about what it looks like, when it's actually rendered in the browser, all of this is going to get expanded on into HTML. It's probably going to be a lot bigger than like 36 pages, right? But it's going to be a lot bigger than 36 lines of code. But instead, being able to create these components, it's almost like creating reusable functions when you're writing code, right? You think about like, what is the purpose of a function in programming? Is that, hey, I don't want to keep writing the same thing over and over again. Like I just want to be able to call it whenever I need it. You can think about creating these components, and again, regardless of whether you're doing Blazor or JavaScript or not, you can think about it in the same way, right? Like I want to have like some reusable bits of functionality that I don't have to write all the time. I can kind of just reuse it. Right. So these are the couple of ones that I have here. I have the info, the customer table, and the products table.
And that looks very similar to what you would then do with a JavaScript framework, because if I was using Svelte or React or whatever it is, I'm doing that exact same thing. Is that I'm creating that component. Those then behave an awful lot like HTML tags. I can then pass in attributes and reuse them just like you're using here with Blazor.
Exactly. Again, which is why when we kind of go back to that previous question, when someone was asking, which one should I learn first or whatever the case is, they're all very similar, right? Like, so once you learn one and you have a pretty general understanding of the workflow, I don't think it'll be very hard for you to switch over to another one, because like the mental model that you have to paint is pretty similar. Okay, now here's one thing I want to tell you about this component, right? So as you can see here, I'm going to tell you about these. I'm going to tell you about these other components I have in here, but specifically for index. Now, you might notice that there's actually no code in here, right? So you might be like, oh, where's the code coming from? So in Blazor, we have 2 options of inserting code inside of a page, right? I could use what's called a code tag, and the code tag pretty much just looks like this, right? Like I could kind of come at the bottom and I could just start typing code, right? And as you can see here, I have what's that called? GitHub Copilot that wants to put stuff in my browser for me, but we're not going to do that. But I could start, just typing in, .NET stuff, right? Private, I don't know, let's call this lists of, date time or whatever the case, right? Like I could start typing in stuff there, and now this code would be, and see, there you go, right? Like now, I might need to turn off this Copilot thing because it's just going to keep writing stuff for me. But I think you get the point, right? Like I could start writing code in here, but now the code would have access to the HTML and vice versa, right? Like I could start to, attach the different events and, so on and so forth. That's one way I could do it. The other way that I like to do it sometimes is I like to create what's called a base class, and I could just say here at the top @inherents from index.base. Now, when would I use one versus the other? And I'll show you what that index base looks like, but let's talk about this for a quick second. Now, for me, I find like when there's a little bit of code, or if the code is fairly trivial, I'm trying to use nice words. When the code is fairly trivial, I have no problem putting it inside of here, right? Like inside of the same Blazor file. But then I find when the code gets a little bit more complicated, there's more things happening. Now it starts to look a little bit cluttered, and I might want to, create some space between this HTML and the actual code that I'm writing, like the actual C# code that I'm writing. So that's what this inherit does, right? It takes the code that I would have had embedded inside of this Blazor file, and it puts it in a different file instead, right? And why don't we go ahead and take a look inside of it?
So it's sort of like just importing in an external JavaScript file if we just kind of keep analogizing it back.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay.
Exactly, right? And as you can see here, so this is what it has inside of it, right? Like we have, this has a dictionary, which is a dictionary of string to string, which has information for the info title. Like this is just some of the data. This is the thing that I'm using to, for the load me later component. We'll talk about that later. And then I also have this Stripe service here that's giving me like customer price information and things of that nature, right? But these are essentially the things that I'm using. And like I said before, I could copy this over and I could have embedded it inside of the Razor file. But again, you have options to do one or the other, right? So I kind of wanted to show you this to let you know that this is an option if you might have a particular preference.
So SMAP UK over on Twitch asked the question, why not just use a partial class and a code behind instead of using that inherits in that index base?
Yeah, you could definitely use a partial class also. I believe there's also support for that. It's just preference. I mean, I like using the base classes because when it comes down to IntelliSense, it's able to, for me anyway, it's able to pick up, what are some of the methods and things of that nature I could use off of this component class. Like when you just use a partial class, again, when you just use a partial class, it just attaches to this thing. And for me, the IntelliSense is not as good. But that's just me. That's me personally. Again, some folks like it, some folks like this way. It's really just a matter of preference. Kind of like it's a matter of preference of whether you want to have your code inside of this file or not, right? It just depends on how you want to do it, but you do have some options based on what your code flow looks like.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions?
There's one other question, but it doesn't fit here, so we'll get to it at the end. It's a performance question, but we can ask that towards the end.
Sure. All right. No problem. All right. So I've shown you the index page. I've shown you, pretty much, again, this is what renders that initial page. Let's start looking into some of these little components. Now, I'm going to look at the load me later last, hence pushing that back even later. And I'm going to show you some of these other components first because they're a little bit smaller. And I think once you understand what those do, it'll be a little bit easier to understand some of the other ones. So I'm going to open up my project and let's first take a look at that info tile. So inside of this components, well, let's look at this, right? And if we kind of if you look at this, right, this is all the HTML that it takes to create this component. And as you can see, all it does is that it has a title and it has a subtitle, and that's all that it does, right? Like I use this, this is standard HTML5. I use an article HTML tag, and then I just have 2 paragraphs in here. So now we have to think about, well, where does this data come from, right? Like how do we use this? And if I open up the code section, inside of the code here, I have a lot of different properties inside of here. Now, there's a couple ways, like I mentioned before, that you could pass data from like a parent to a child component, right? Now, when you think about parents and children, for instance, here I was inside of the index. And so the info tile is like the child, right? Because it's inside of the page. So if I wanted to pass information from the parent to the child, I could use attributes, right? And so 2 of the attributes that I created on this were subtitle, and I also have title. And I also actually have 3 of them. I actually have CSS in here as well, right? Now, let's talk about what some of these things do. Now, here inside of my unparameter set, right, what I'm doing is I'm connecting into what's called like the life cycle, right? Like, and this is the same with every other web framework you might use. Like, there's going to be some type of life cycle. On render, pre-render, unattached DOM, everyone has like a different set of life cycles that you want to hook into. In this particular one, I'm hooking into when the parameters are set. So this is saying after the parent has set the parameters for this child component, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to grab some data, right? So I'm getting the customer summary and the product count specifically. And then all I'm going to do is I'm just going to assign it to these values, right? And that's what happens, right? So that's where this and this comes in. Now, where does the more CSS come in? Well, if you remember, I'm going to come back here. If you look at these tiles, right, and these are the 2 info tiles, right, the one that says 345 and the one that says 880. Notice the CSS is a little bit different, like I'm using different highlight colors for them, very specifically. Now, I didn't want to hard code the CSS, right? I wanted to be able to have a little bit of flexibility there. So what I did was I created this thing called more CSS, which is really just a string. And notice here inside of when I specify the class attributes, I just do an @ more CSS. And this @ is how I'm able to access, this code that's at the bottom, like these different variables and functions and things of that nature. So now, again, if we kind of go back and look really quickly of how we use it, you can see here, and I'll zoom into this just a little bit more, right? Right, you can see I have these two info tiles, right? And in more CSS, I'm just giving them different CSS classes, right? So it has like the base CSS class, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. But then I want to add specific CSSs or CSS attributes to them. And so that's what this other thing here does. So even though you look at this code, it looks like, there's a lot of code here, but it's really not doing a lot. I'm really just specifying parameters, and then I'm using that to create this component here. And this is what I like to call a read-only component. It's not doing anything other than just showing data. So hopefully that makes sense. And let me know if folks have any thoughts or questions about that part of it.
Yeah, that all makes a lot of sense. I also appreciate, like, it feels very natural as a C# developer that I admittedly haven't done C# a whole lot recently, but I sort of like cut my teeth, so to speak, once Sure. I got off of VB script doing C#. So it looks very natural, feels very natural to me, everything that you've got there. One of the real quick questions is just a real quick one about IntelliSense for Visual Studio Code. Is that baked in, or are you using an extension for that?
I am using an extension. I'm using the C# extension.
Okay.
So if you come into extensions and you just type .NET, or I think it's called C#. I think it's literally just called C#. Where is it? Oh, not C$, but C#. There you go. Yeah, I'm just using this extension.
Oh, okay. Okay. Perfect.
Yeah. But once you have that extension, it'll give you support for the web-based applications, and again, syntax highlighting and IntelliSense for some different things as well. So yeah, that's the only extension I have. So so if you were talking about getting started with C# and VS Code in general, there are bundles, right? So there's a C# .NET bundle, which is what I'm using, and then also you'd need to have the .NET SDK installed in your machine.
Okay.
But other than that, those would be the two main things you'd need to be able to create this application.
Okay. Perfect.
Okay, cool. So now we saw what the info tile one looks like. So let's take a look at some of these other ones, right? So if we look here, you can see there's a customers one, and there's also popular products. So why don't we take a look at the customers one first, and then we'll kind of go into popular products. And one of the things you'll notice here too, like some folks may be wondering, or maybe you know already, like how does it know the name of the component? Well, the name of the component is the name of the file, right? So I called my file customer table, so hence when I use customer table. And this one is called info tile because that's what I called the file. I think you can rename it if you wanted to, or you could just change the name of the file, but that's pretty much how it works. Now, as we're looking at this one is the customer table component, right? So again, very similar to what we saw before, except this one is a little bit more markup, right? There's a little bit more HTML and CSS markup inside of here, and there's a little bit more code inside of here too. From the perspective of what I'm doing here is I'm rendering a table that shows me a list of customer data. So let's look at the HTML first. And again, a lot of these you see card and content and tables, full width and things of that nature. Those are all from Bulma, because remember I'm just using Bulma as my styling thing. You might use Bootstrap or Tailwind or whatever the thing, whatever your framework of choice. It all works just fine. So this is just the table. But here now, notice inside of the body of the table, inside of that T body, I have like this if statement that's in here, right? And remember, every time I use an @ sign, this is when I start to plug in code, right? Like this is like, .NET saying, okay, this is where code begins kind of thing. So here I have an if statement, and I have some, pretty much I have a list of customers. So I'm pretty much saying if my list of customers is not empty, right? Like if there's stuff in there, I want you to loop over my list of customers, and I want you to create these TRs, right? These table rows. And for my table rows, I'm going to create this, this right here is just like a font awesome icon. And then, the customer ID, the email address, and the total amount, that I got back from that customer data, right? And now it's just going to loop through and it's going to generate that table for me. Now, if we scroll down a little bit, as you can see here, the only thing that I'm doing here that's of real importance is I'm saying here is the customer data, like this is where it's going to go. And by default, I'm just saying it's empty, right? There's nothing in it by default on line 48. But here, remember we talked about custom events, right? So this event is saying whenever this component is initialized. So it's pretty much saying whenever this component is turned on, right? Like I'm not passing any components from the parent. I'm not doing anything crazy. All I'm doing is whenever the component is ready to use, pretty much, I want you to go get the customer data, right? And I get that customer data and I assign it to this property.
So that would be similar to like on mount in like React or other places.
Yeah, it's like on mount or something of that sort in other places. Yeah. So the component's ready to go, loop through and generate this table, right? And again, I'm going to switch back really quickly. So this is the table here that I'm talking about that it generates, right? So here are those font awesome icons that I'm using. And here's just some random, this is fake data, folks. This is not real people, so don't get mad at me. No PII is being shown here. But again, this is just random, emails and things of that nature that have been generated to show in this particular table. And so that's the customer table. So now again, I have this separate component that I could use. If I wanted to use it on this page or another page or whatever the case is. Now, again, you can start to see like the power of taking these Lego blocks and putting them together in like little bits and pieces. And I'll show you the products table really quickly, but I'm pretty sure y'all are starting to get the point, right? Like we're gonna do the same thing again, right? We're gonna have some CSS. I'm gonna see if there's any products in the product list, and I'm gonna loop through and I'm gonna output them, right? And that's pretty much what's happening here. And again, I'm doing the same thing here again, like on initialized. Instead of getting the customer summary, this time I'm getting the product count, and then I'm outputting that to the browser, and then that's what that looks like here in the site. Okay, now let's go to the fun one. The fun one is the load me later one, because I know that's what everyone wants to see.
It is now later.
Let's head back. What's that?
I said it is now later.
It is now later, so we can take a look at it. So here's the thing. If you recall, when the application first loaded, and I know maybe some of you were here in the beginning or not, maybe you weren't. Actually, let me kill this. Let me stop this. Kill is a bad word. Let me stop this and run it again, right? What you may notice, right, is that when I first run this application, and I did stop it, so this is going to happen. Right? What you notice is that the customer data didn't load immediately. And that's because sometimes you're running applications and there might be a delay, right? And so what do you think is a good customer experience for you to have? Should my page just be a blank white page and my browser just spitting, or should I be like, okay, well, we got your request, give us a second, I'm going to show you some things, right? Notice here too, as I talk to you, about every 5 or 10 seconds or so, like the words change, right? It says, I'm coming, yeah. I'm really coming. Not much longer. I'll be there in a second.
Reticulating splines.
Right. And so, but I do it there because again, I'm thinking about that customer experience, right? Like, I know it's taking a long time. The app isn't broken. See, I got like the little emoji and everything, right? It's taking a little while. It's coming, and then now I'm able to render my UI. So like, how are we able to create an experience like that? Well, something that's able to like delay the rendering of stuff. And so that's where the load me later component comes into play. Now I'm gonna move down this terminal really quick because we don't really need that. And if you recall, inside of my my index page, right, the load me later section pretty much like wraps every other component, right? So if you think about it, like I have load me later and I have child elements inside of it, but I'm saying, I have this when ready property. I'm saying I want you to look at this thing and let me know when the data is ready to load. And when it's ready to load, here's the stuff I want you to show, right? That's pretty much what I'm saying, right? So whatever I put here in, ready when, this is kind of me signaling, well, this is when you'll know, well, when the data is ready, right? If that makes sense. So let's head over to load me later and see what this looks like. And again, there's not a lot of code here, but it's really interesting to take a look at. So first I have an is ready property, right? And if it's ready, then I want you to show the child content. Now, if you remember when I showed you that previous page, that child content was the stuff that I had in between that that load me later element, right? But until it's ready, I want you to show this, right? So this is the part where I'm like, I'm not ready yet, but you could show this stuff to folks until I get to that point, right? So this is my if else. If you're ready, show the child content. If you're not ready, show this other stuff that's here. And again, because we're doing .NET, and I'm going to point out something really interesting here too. I'm using what are called .NET timers. I'll scroll down here a little bit. So I created a timer, and I'm pretty much just going to say start the timer, right? And then every time like the timer fires off, I want you to call this rotates text method, right? So the component's initialized, and when it starts up, create a timer, start the timer. And then I'm going to wait until whenever ready when tells me it's done. And then when it's ready, I'm going to say it's true. I'm going to stop the timer, and then I'm going to refresh the page, right? So let's talk through that again, because I know that might be a lot for some folks, right? So all the component is going to do, I'm going to specify a ready when operation. Like this is when I know the data is done and it's ready for me to use. But until then, I'm just going to have a timer spinning. And every time like a tick happens in the timer, it's going to rotate the text that we're seeing on the screen. And I think here, all right, so this is 15,000, so that's like 15 seconds pretty much. I thought it was shorter than that, but I guess every 15 seconds it's going to load. Here's the reference to the child content. So in Blazor specifically, we call that a render fragment. Right, so anything that you're going to put in between the tags of your custom component, you could pretty much call that a render fragment, right? So now that render fragment of child content, and then here I have a pretty much like an event callback, right? So in my callback, I'm going to specify pretty much a function, and whenever that function returns, then it's going to say, okay, well, it's successfully completed or not, and then it'll show my stuff.
Okay.
And then my loading text, my loading text is really just a bunch of strings, right? That are here, and we kind of just loop through the strings, right? Like one moment we're generating a report, not much longer. Any moment now, seriously, we're almost done. All right, we kind of just go through those, but then. Again, I'm doing this because I think it's important that we show some type of visual indication to our users that stuff is actually happening. Because how many times have you gone to a page and it just sticks there, and it doesn't do anything, and you're not sure if it's actually doing work or not, and you might hit refresh a couple times or just leave in general because you don't want to wait for it.
Yeah, 100%. It's one of the things actually that I kind of miss about now that we have solid state drives is you don't get the little flashing on your computer, you don't hear the hard drive spinning, so that way hey, there's something actually happening. It can just be nothing. So I definitely appreciate you putting it out there. We've got about like 10 minutes left, and I think all of that demo is perfect. I think you've shown the power of Blazor pretty well there. And in fact, there's a couple of people that are calling out, like Dale mentions, seems like a React easy mode. Which, I mean, it's worth highlighting. This is not designed to be, let's take over React here, that, all of these frameworks can live side by side, but that's still kind of a nice little bit of feedback. And then there's one real quick question that I'm going to get into a couple of meatier ones. Meatier ones is, are you working on an Intel base or an M1 Mac?
I have an Intel-based Mac. My Mac is the 2018 MacBook Pro, so I have an Intel-based Mac. If anyone has an M1 Mac, I'd be interested to hear how they feel about it. I don't know anyone that has one, but if you like it, if you think it's been really cool for development, I'd love to hear.
I don't have one. Anyway, let's see. First question that's Tiny Asteroid, Little Meteor, is from Microsoft Learn, is from a scaling perspective, how is the scalability of WebAssembly in comparison to a JavaScript framework?
I mean, I'd tell you WebAssembly does everything that JavaScript can do. So, I mean, it runs in the same context, in the same sandbox. Yeah, I mean, if it, the performance is fairly similar.
Okay.
They might be like So from a Blazor perspective, right? Because we're talking about WebAssembly and not Blazor, because Blazor runs inside of WebAssembly. You know, the whole purpose of WebAssembly is to be able to run native code in the browser. So, native code, as you can imagine, it's not interpreted, or, there's no REPL or anything like that. Like, it runs, natively. The performance is pretty good, right? So at that point, it really just becomes, how fast is your browser and how efficient is your code.
Okay, perfect. And then the next question, I'm trying to find it. I know it was on YouTube, and I cannot remember who it was that asked it. But the question was about obfuscation. So
Sure.
I'm assuming that that whatever the intermediate language code that's being compiled into that DLL that's then going to be sent down and run inside the browser, I'm assuming that would then potentially be accessible by the client. Is there anything that can be done there for obfuscation? Is that not necessarily a thing?
Sure. I mean, again, it's just like any other .NET application. And what I'm doing right now is I'm actually going to open my project folder, and I'm going to actually show you what goes in there. So I'm going to go to bin debug, and I think it's right. So like, this is the stuff that'll get sent to it, right? I mean, some of the stuff is debug, like the PDBs and things of that nature don't go, but essentially you're going to get like .dll files. Right, like this is the name of my project. It's like this .dll file is going to get sent to the browser. So again, if you think about like other language, if you think about like JavaScript, like the JavaScript file gets sent to the browser, and the JavaScript is very much of a human readable file. With .NET, it's going to send .dll files. Now, from that perspective, yes, you could capture the DLL files, and you could disassemble the DLL files if you wanted to, and do all those sorts of things. If you wanted to, I believe, I'm not sure, so don't quote me, but they are I can't say that word. Oh my gosh, obfuscators. Gosh, I can't say that word. I'm sorry, Christopher. But there are things that will mangle your code, right? To protect it a little bit more. Just like when you ship desktop applications or web applications, or mobile applications. I believe this should work in Blazor, because again, at the end of the day, it's about like the DLL itself. And again, you can have those signed and things of that nature too.
Okay.
So, but by default, again, we're not shipping the C# code, right? We're shipping the DLL. So now it would be a matter of, yes, you'd have to, if you wanted to, if that's important to you, you'd have to find a way to obfuscate. I was close. I almost said it. Obfuscate that DLL file.
You got close enough.
I was close. I tried. I'm doing my best.
Let's see. John Wick Park asks a question. I'm actually going to change this ever so slightly.
Sure.
But the question is, how should I check out the cost for server-side rendering on Azure before deployment? And so I'm going to immediately, of course, pivot into Azure Static Web Apps, which for a lot of the types of applications that you might be building is going to be free. Can you do server-side rendering with Blazor with Azure Static Web Apps?
Can you do server-side rendering with Azure Static Web Apps? I don't think so.
Okay.
And this is why I say that. With Azure Static Web Apps, okay, so let's kind of take a step back. Now, remember in the beginning I told you like there are some different models for running Blazor applications. Mm-hmm. So in this particular application I'm running, it's running hosted in an ASP.NET Core app, right? So that means that there's a server-side component and then there's a front-end component, right? So the Blazor stuff, all the components that I've shown you, with the exception of this host that file here, right, is pretty much rendered in Blazor, right? Now, notice here in Blazor, you have the option to say server rendered preferred, right? So this is pretty much you saying, hey, do I want to render it on the server or not, right? But again, those are those static assets we're talking about. I guess kind of like if you had a React app and you could like server render it first and then everything else happens in the browser, is like a very similar type approach. Now, I'm saying all of this because with Azure Static Web Apps, because it's just static assets, right? Like probably what you'd do is you'd probably want to build or compose your application, and then you'd send it over to what you deploy it to Azure Static Web Apps, right? You deploy it inside of the container that it runs inside, but there's no server that you can really take control of, right? Like you're gonna need like an ASP.NET thing in the background.
Okay.
Maybe later that might be a thing that we could do. Today we can't, but if you're doing something like app service or something like that, then yeah, that's something that you could definitely do.
Okay. That's fair. And there's a free tier of app service. It's relatively limited, but there is a free tier of app service. So if somebody was wanting to play around with that, they could go ahead and do that. Trying to just sift through the chat here. We've had just like a little bit of a burst. We've got like 2 minutes left. Why can I not find the question that here it is. Lolo asks over on YouTube, can't remember, but thought it's compiled for every browser platform type when it's accessed by the browser. So is this, is that intermediate language that's being sent down as part of WebAssembly, is that going to be recompiled particular for the browser, for the client system?
Is it going to be recompiled specific to run in the browser?
Yeah, it was specific to different browsers. So if I'm running this on a Mac or if I'm running this on Windows, is it going to be compiled differently?
No, it's not.
Okay.
It's not going to be compiled differently. I mean, again, remember the thing that's being compiled is like your .NET code, right? Everything else that's here, you know what I mean? Like this is standard HTML and CSS and things of that nature.
Okay.
Right. And so this is going to get sent to the browser as pretty much as is, and then your browser would render it. So if you're worried about like differences in browsers in terms of support for special HTML tags and things of that nature, I mean, you'd do your I think all of these CSS frameworks have like different browser resets and all those types of things. Like all those things still work the same, and that's fine. If you wanted to build a different version of the app for a different browser, yeah, I don't know how you do that, to be honest with you. Okay. I mean, you'd probably have to do something in this host file that runs on the server to kind of detect that first, and then, then like the app that you're sending it here could be different, right? Because here I'm just sending it the app, right? The component that I sent you, but maybe you might want to have a Firefox app and a Chrome app and a app whatever, whatever, right? And then but then you'd have to build those separately, and then now you'd have some conditional logic in here, right? Like you'd say at I don't know, we'll say if. I'm not saying this is going to work. I'm just writing random code, right? But if is Chrome, right? Like
right, okay,
move this up here and like render the Chrome app. Kind of thing, right? And then you'd do some type of browser sniffing to kind of figure that out.
Okay, that makes complete sense. And then 10 seconds. What's the name of the weekly show that you run? Terry Connor wants to know if you have a channel. So what's the name of the weekly show that you run?
Oh, sure. I do the On.NET show. It's available on the .NET YouTube channel. So that's youtube.com/.NET. We're on every Thursday at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We stream for about an hour. We talk all cool things .NET.
Beautiful. Cecil, thank you so much for coming on, chatting us through Blazor. That is Web Wednesday. Thank you to everybody for tuning in. Bye.